I never thought the words "get out" could sound so cold coming from my own son's mouth. But there I was, at 62, standing in the living room of the house I had called home for 35 years, listening to Carlos speak to me like I was a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. The rain drummed against the windows with the same relentless rhythm that had been echoing in my chest for months, a constant reminder that storms don't ask permission before they arrive. I clutched my old brown suitcase, the same one I'd carried when I first moved to this house as a young bride, full of dreams and hope. Now it held the remnants of a life that had somehow become inconvenient to the person I loved most in this world. "You're not listening, Mom," Carlos said, his voice carrying that particular kind of impatience reserved for people who've already made up their minds and are tired of pretending to care about your feelings. "I've told you 3 times already. The house needs renovations, and you're always in the way. Either find somewhere else to live, or I'll start looking at nursing homes tomorrow." The way he said nursing homes made my skin crawl, not because I was afraid of growing old, but because he spoke about discarding me with the same casual indifference he might use when discussing what to do with an old piece of furniture that no longer matched his decor. I wanted to remind him of the nights I'd spent by his bedside when he was 8 years old, burning with fever, when his father had already left us and there was no one else to keep watch. I wanted to tell him about the double shifts I'd worked at the textile factory, coming home with fingers so stiff from operating machinery that I could barely turn the doorknob, all so he could have the school supplies and clothes that other children took for granted. Instead, I stood there in silence, watching my only child, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the toddler whose scraped knees I'd kissed better, the teenager whose homework I'd helped with even when my own education had been cut short by circumstances beyond my control. Look at me like I was nothing more than an obstacle to his plans. The house around us felt different now, transformed from a home into a real estate investment that needed to be optimized for maximum return. Carlos had been working in construction for 15 years, and his success had brought with it a new language of square footage and market value that seemed to leave no room for sentiment or the messy realities of human attachment. He'd married Sophia 3 years ago, a woman 10 years younger who smiled at me during family gatherings while making subtle comments about updating and modernizing, everything that reminded her that this house had existed long before she'd entered our lives. She had opinions about my furniture. "So dated," she'd say with a laugh that was supposed to soften the criticism, but somehow made it cut deeper. Sophia never said anything directly cruel, but she had perfected the art of making suggestions that felt like orders wrapped in false concern. "Don't you think Marcia would be happier somewhere with people her own age?" she'd ask Carlos while I was standing right there, as if my presence had become so insignificant that I might as well have been invisible. The worst part wasn't even the disrespect. It was watching my son nod along, agreeing with assessments of my life and my needs made by someone who'd known me for 3 years while he'd known me for 34. He'd become a stranger who happened to share my last name and my memories, but none of my values or understanding of what family was supposed to mean. I remembered the Carlos who used to bring me flowers he'd picked from the neighbor's garden when he was 5, presenting them with the proud smile of someone who believed his mother deserved beautiful things. I remembered the teenager who'd defended me when his father came around drunk, demanding money and making threats he was too cowardly to follow through on when sober. Where was that boy now? When had he transformed into this man who could look at his aging mother and see only an inconvenience that needed to be managed with the efficiency of a business transaction? The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been widening for months without either of us acknowledging it. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the windows, and I found myself wondering if this was what drowning felt like, not the dramatic gasping for air that movies showed, but this slow, steady pressure in your chest that made each breath feel like work. "I raised you alone," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because speaking any louder might have shattered what remained of my composure. "After your father left, it was just us." I thought that meant something. Carlos ran a hand through his hair. The same gesture he'd made as a child when he was trying to avoid responsibility for something he'd broken. "That was different, Mom. That was then. Things change. People grow up. I have my own family to think about now. His own family. as if I'd been demoted from family member to some other category that came with fewer rights and considerations. As if 34 years of loving him, supporting him, sacrificing for him had expired like a warranty that was no longer valid. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. Comment below and let me know what city you're watching from. I looked around the living room one more time, taking in the walls that had witnessed every milestone of our shared life. The corner where Carlos had taken his first steps, wobbling between the couch and my outstretched arms. The spot near the window where we'd set up his train set every Christmas morning, both of us sitting on the floor in our pajamas, building elaborate tracks that would be torn down and rebuilt a dozen times before the holidays ended. The kitchen table where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd eaten countless meals together, where I'd listened to him practice speeches for school presentations and complain about teachers who didn't understand his brilliance. All of it now reduced to space that needed to be optimized and updates that would increase property value. My suitcase felt heavier than it should have, weighted down not just with clothes and toiletries, but with the crushing realization that home isn't a place. It's the people who make you feel like you belong somewhere. And I was learning, at 62, that belonging could be revoked without warning or appeal. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and neither did the cold determination in my son's eyes. I was about to discover that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we've loved longest, and sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that the boy I'd raised to be kind and grateful had grown into a man who could look at his mother's tears and feel nothing but relief that his problem was about to solve itself. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the door, not knowing that this moment of abandonment would lead me to something I'd never dared to dream possible. A life where I was valued, respected, and finally understood that I deserved so much more than I'd ever allowed myself to want. The porch steps felt colder than they should have in April, but then again, everything felt different when you realized your own flesh and blood could dispose of you like yesterday's newspaper. I sat there with my suitcase beside me, watching the rain create small rivers that carried away the fallen petals from the cherry tree Carlos and I had planted together when he was 12. He'd been so excited about that tree, measuring its growth every week, convinced that watching it closely would somehow make it grow faster. "Mom, look, it's got new leaves," he'd shout, dragging me outside to witness what he considered miraculous progress. Now the tree towered over the house, 40 feet of solid wood and seasonal beauty, but the boy who'd planted it with such hope had grown into someone who could watch his mother sit in the rain without feeling compelled to invite her back inside. Through the living room window, I could see Sophia moving around, already rearranging furniture, as if my presence had been the only thing preventing her from making the changes she'd been planning for months. She carried a lamp from one side of the room to the other, studying the effect with the critical eye of someone auditioning pieces for a home decorating magazine. Carlos stood behind her, nodding approval at each adjustment, and I realized with nauseating clarity that this moment had been choreographed long before today's conversation. They'd been planning my removal the way other people planned vacation itineraries, discussing logistics, timing, and the most efficient way to achieve their desired outcome. I thought about the Sunday dinners I'd prepared for 3 years, learning Sophia's preferences, accommodating her dietary restrictions, pretending not to notice when she photographed the meals I'd spent hours preparing so she could post them on social media as examples of family traditions she was maintaining. She'd never once offered to help with the cooking or cleaning, but she was certainly quick to take credit for the atmosphere of domestic harmony that my labor had created. The rain soaked through my sweater, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Moving would mean accepting that this was really happening, that the life I'd built in this house was truly over. I'd painted every room, planted every flower in the garden, replaced every broken fixture with my own hands and my own money. This house contained 35 years of my life, and now I was supposed to just walk away as if none of it mattered. A car passed by, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt, and I found myself wondering what the driver saw. Just an old woman sitting in the rain with a suitcase, or someone whose story might be worth understanding. Probably the former. Society had trained people to look away from uncomfortable scenes, to assume that visible suffering was somehow deserved or could be easily remedied if the victim just tried harder. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, appeared at her window, her face creased with concern as she noticed my unusual situation. We'd been neighbors for 22 years, sharing garden tips and borrowed cups of sugar, but not the kind of friendship that extended to crisis intervention. She'd wave, ask about my health, compliment my roses, but we'd never crossed the line into personal territory that might require her to get involved in family drama. I watched her hesitate behind her curtain, probably debating whether my business was her business, whether offering help might create complications she wasn't prepared to handle. After a few minutes, her face disappeared from the window, and I understood. Everyone had their own problems, their own families to worry about. I couldn't blame her for choosing to mind her own business when getting involved might make her life more complicated. The front door opened behind me, and for a moment, my heart jumped with the hope that Carlos had come to his senses, that he'd realized what he was doing and wanted to apologize. Instead, Sophia appeared, carrying a small umbrella and wearing the kind of concerned expression that people practice in mirrors before delivering bad news. "Marcia," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "you're getting soaked out here. Don't you think you should call someone? Maybe that friend of yours from church?" She was referring to Donna Carmem, a woman in her 70s who lived in a tiny apartment across town and survived on a pension that barely covered her medication costs. The suggestion that I might impose on someone in worse circumstances than my own revealed everything I needed to know about Sophia's understanding of friendship, loyalty, and basic human decency. "I'm thinking," I replied, not bothering to look at her. The last thing I wanted was to see her face pretending concern while her eyes calculated how long it might take for me to disappear from her life completely. "Well, you can't sit here all night," she continued, as if she were the homeowner and I were some vagrant who'd wandered onto her property. "It's not safe, and the neighbors will start asking questions." The neighbors asking questions. That was her real concern. Not my safety or comfort, but the possibility that my public suffering might reflect poorly on her reputation in the community. She wanted me gone, but she wanted my removal to be clean and quiet, without any messy emotional scenes that might make people think less of her husband's family. "Carlos is worried about you," she added, though I noticed he wasn't worried enough to come outside himself and express that concern directly. "He thinks maybe you should stay somewhere temporarily while you figure out your next steps." Temporarily. Next steps. The language of business consultants applied to the destruction of a family relationship. Everything had to be reframed in terms that made cruelty sound reasonable, that transformed abandonment into strategic planning for mutual benefit. I finally looked up at her, this woman who'd inserted herself into my family and slowly poisoned the relationship between my son and me with suggestions that always sounded helpful, but somehow always resulted in my feeling smaller, less important, more expendable. She stood there under her umbrella, perfectly dry and perfectly comfortable, waiting for me to make her life easier by removing myself from the equation she wanted to solve. "Tell Carlos," I said slowly, tasting each word before I spoke it, "that I raised him to be better than this." Something flickered across her face. Maybe guilt, maybe irritation at my refusal to play the role of grateful burden being graciously released from obligation. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it and went back inside, probably to report to my son that his mother was being difficult and unreasonable. The rain continued, heavier now, and I realized that sitting here wasn't accomplishing anything except making me wetter and more miserable. But where was I supposed to go? I had some savings, not much, but enough for a hotel room for a few nights while I figured out what came next. The thought of walking into a hotel lobby with my old suitcase, looking like exactly what I was, a homeless old woman with nowhere else to turn, made my stomach clench with embarrassment. I'd spent my entire adult life avoiding situations that might make me appear needy or pathetic. I'd worked extra shifts rather than ask for help, had patched clothes rather than buy new ones, had eaten rice and beans for weeks at a time rather than admit I was struggling financially. The idea of becoming visible in my desperation felt almost worse than the desperation itself. But sitting in the rain wasn't solving anything, and I could feel my body temperature dropping as my clothes became more saturated. I stood up, my knees protesting after sitting on cold concrete for over an hour, and picked up my suitcase. It felt heavier now, waterlogged and unwieldy, like everything else in my life had become. As I walked toward the street, I turned back once to look at the house that had been my home for most of my adult life. The warm yellow light glowing through the windows looked inviting and peaceful, the kind of scene that would make passers-by think about the comfort of family and the security of belonging somewhere. They had no idea that inside, two people were probably celebrating their successful removal of an inconvenient obstacle to their perfect life together. They couldn't see that the woman walking away in the rain had given everything she had to make that house a home, and that her son was throwing away the love of someone who would have died for him without a second thought. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I wasn't wanted. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is remove yourself from situations where your presence is treated as a burden rather than a gift. The rain showed no mercy, and neither had my family. The hotel lobby smelled like industrial disinfectant and artificial flowers, the kind of place that charged by the night and asked no questions about why someone might need temporary shelter at 7 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday evening. The clerk behind the desk looked up from his phone with the bored expression of someone who'd seen every variation of human desperation and had learned to process it without emotional investment. "How many nights?" he asked, his fingers already moving toward the registration computer as if my answer was irrelevant to whatever rate he planned to charge. "Just tonight," I said, though I had no idea what tomorrow would bring or where I might go when this borrowed time expired. "Maybe longer? I'm not sure yet." He quoted a price that made me wince. More than I'd spent on groceries in a typical week, for a room that probably hadn't been updated since the 1980s. But I handed over my credit card anyway, because the alternative was sleeping in my car or walking the streets until I found somewhere else that would accept my money in exchange for basic shelter. The room was exactly what I'd expected. Thin towels, a television that received 3 channels clearly, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot where people came and went without making eye contact. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the fact that this anonymous box was now the closest thing I had to a home. I'd left the house with only what fit in one suitcase, which meant I had 3 changes of clothes, basic toiletries, and the few items I'd grabbed without thinking. A photo of Carlos at his high school graduation, his face shining with the confidence of someone who believed the world was full of opportunities waiting for him to claim them. Looking at it now, I wondered when he'd stopped seeing me as the person who'd made those opportunities possible, and started seeing me as the person standing in the way of bigger and better things. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, I thought it might be Carlos, maybe apologizing, maybe asking if I was safe. Instead, it was Sophia. "Left some of your things on the porch. Didn't want them to get ruined in the rain. Some of my things." 35 years of accumulated possessions reduced to whatever she'd deemed worth saving from the weather. I wondered what she'd chosen. Probably items that had no sentimental value to her, but that she thought might be useful to me in whatever new life I was expected to build from scratch. The things that mattered: photo albums, my mother's jewelry. The quilt I'd sewn by hand during Carlos's first year of life had probably been deemed clutter that needed to be disposed of efficiently. I walked to the hotel window and stared out at the parking lot, watching a family load luggage into their car. The children were arguing about something while their parents moved with the practiced efficiency of people who traveled regularly, who had places to go and people expecting them. They belonged to the world of normal families, the kind where love didn't come with expiration dates and where aging parents were treasures to be cherished rather than burdens to be managed. The rain had finally stopped, but the pavement still gleamed with moisture that reflected the parking lot lights in broken patterns. Everything looked distorted and unfamiliar, as if I were seeing the world through water, as if I'd been submerged in circumstances that made normal life impossible to navigate. I tried calling my cousin Elena, who lived 2 hours away in a retirement community that didn't allow overnight guests. We'd stayed in touch over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional phone calls about family news, but we'd never developed the kind of closeness that would make asking for help feel natural rather than humiliating. "Marcia?" Elena's voice carried surprise and a note of concern that suggested she'd already heard something about my situation through the family grapevine that somehow always carried bad news faster than good news. I was just thinking about you. Carmen mentioned she'd heard something about you and Carlos having some kind of disagreement. Disagreement. The word made my situation sound like a minor difference of opinion that could be resolved through better communication rather than the systematic dismantling of everything I'd thought permanent in my life. But that was how these stories got told and retold, each retelling making the victim's pain seem smaller and more manageable, easier for everyone else to dismiss. "It's more than a disagreement," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He asked me to leave. Today. I'm in a hotel." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to understand that Elena was calculating how much involvement she was willing to risk, weighing her sympathy for my situation against the potential complications of getting too deeply involved in family drama that might reflect poorly on her own reputation. "Oh, Marcia," she finally said, her voice heavy with the kind of sadness that people feel when they hear about tragedies happening to people they care about, but can't actually help. "I'm so sorry. I wish I could offer you a place to stay, but you know how strict they are here about visitors. And with my arthritis acting up, I'm barely managing my own daily routine." I assured her I understood, because I did. Elena was 78 years old, living on a fixed income in a community that had rules designed to maintain order and prevent the kind of disruptions that desperate relatives might bring. She couldn't jeopardize her own housing situation to help me with mine, no matter how much she might want to, but understanding didn't make the rejection sting less. Another door closed, another option eliminated, another person who cared about me but couldn't translate that caring into practical assistance when I needed it most. After we hung up, I sat in the hotel room's single chair and tried to make a mental list of other people I might call. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. I'd spent so many years focused on taking care of Carlos, working to support our household, and maintaining our home that I'd never invested enough time in building the kind of friendships that might sustain me through a crisis like this. The women from church knew me as the quiet one who always volunteered for committees but never shared personal problems. My former co-workers from the textile factory had scattered when the plant closed 8 years ago. Some finding new jobs, others retiring, all of us losing touch as we adapted to changed circumstances in our separate ways. I'd been so busy being the perfect mother, the self-sufficient woman who never asked for help or created problems for anyone else, that I'd become invisible in my own life. People saw me as reliable, helpful, always available to listen to their troubles or assist with their projects, but I'd never positioned myself as someone who might need support in return. The irony was crushing. I'd spent decades teaching Carlos to be independent, to solve his own problems, to avoid becoming a burden to anyone else. I'd succeeded so well that he'd learned to see dependency as weakness and aging as failure, making it inevitable that he'd eventually view his aging mother as an embarrassment to be hidden, rather than a treasure to be protected. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo from Sophia, my belongings scattered on the front porch in garbage bags, already showing water damage from the rain that had been falling when she'd put them outside. The message read, "Thought you'd want to know they're there before someone takes them. Someone takes them." As if my possessions were abandoned property rather than the accumulated artifacts of a life lived in that house for more than 3 decades. As if anyone walking by would see value in the worn clothing and old books of a woman whose own family had deemed her worthless enough to discard. I stared at the photo until my eyes blurred with tears I'd been holding back since this nightmare began. Those garbage bags contained pieces of my mother, gifts from Carlos when he was small and still loved me unconditionally, projects I'd worked on during quiet evenings when the house felt peaceful and permanent. Now they sat on the porch like refuse awaiting collection, exposed to weather and theft, visible evidence to the entire neighborhood that Marcia Santos had been expelled from her own life and that no one cared enough to treat her belongings with basic respect. The hotel room felt smaller with each passing hour, its beige walls closing in like the boundaries of a life that had suddenly contracted to fit the space of someone who mattered to no one. I had enough money for maybe a week of hotel stays, but then what? I was 62 years old with limited job prospects and no references except for supervisors who'd retired or died years ago. The world outside my window continued its normal rhythm, cars arriving and departing, people coming and going with purpose and destination. But I felt suspended outside that normal flow, watching life happen to other people while trying to figure out how someone my age was supposed to rebuild everything from nothing. Tomorrow I would have to start making phone calls, looking for apartments that would accept a woman with no recent rental history and limited income. I would have to explain my situation to strangers who would judge my circumstances and decide whether I was worthy of the basic human need for shelter. But tonight, in this anonymous room that smelled like other people's disappointments, I finally allowed myself to cry for everything I'd lost and everything I was beginning to understand I might never get back. 3 days in the hotel had drained half my savings, and I still had nowhere to go. The classified ads section lay spread across the small table like evidence of a world that had no place for someone like me. Every apartment listing required first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit, and references from previous landlords. The mathematics of poverty had trapped me in an equation I couldn't solve. No pets, no smoking, no elderly appeared in more listings than seemed legal. But I was learning that discrimination came dressed in polite language that skirted around laws designed to protect people like me. Young professional preferred, active lifestyle required, must be able to climb stairs to third floor. All code for the simple truth that aging made you undesirable in ways that went far beyond your ability to pay rent. I'd called 17 apartments by noon on Thursday, and the conversations followed a depressing pattern. Initial politeness when I explained I was looking for a place to rent, followed by uncomfortable silence when I mentioned my age, my limited employment history, and my current hotel residence. "We'll call you back," they said. But my phone remained stubbornly silent except for the automated messages reminding me that my hotel payment would be due again soon. The hotel cleaning lady, a woman about my age with kind eyes and worn hands, had started leaving extra towels and soap in my room. We'd exchanged a few words in Spanish. She was originally from Guatemala and had been in the United States for 30 years, working jobs that required her to be invisible while she cleaned up other people's messes and made their lives more comfortable. "Tienes familia aquí?" she asked softly yesterday, noticing the photo of Carlos I'd propped against the lamp on the nightstand. I told her yes, I had family, but they were busy with their own lives. I couldn't bring myself to explain that my family had actively expelled me from their lives, that the young man in the photo had looked at his aging mother and decided she was expendable. Some truths were too humiliating to speak aloud, even to a stranger who showed more kindness than my own blood. She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd probably seen every variation of family disappointment and had learned not to judge. "A veces," she said. "La familia que elegimos es mejor que la familia que nos dieron." Sometimes the family we choose is better than the family we're given. Her words stayed with me as I continued my futile search for housing, because I was beginning to understand that I'd never learned how to choose family. I'd only known how to serve the family I'd been given, even when that service was taken for granted and eventually rejected. The photo of Carlos seemed to mock me from its place beside the lamp. His graduation day smile, so full of promise and possibility, belonged to a boy who'd believed his mother was the most important person in his world. When had that changed? When had I become someone he could discard without apparent guilt or regret? I tried to remember the exact moment when our relationship had shifted, when his respect had curdled into resentment, and his love had withered into obligation. Maybe it had been gradual, so slow that I'd adapted to each small reduction in warmth until I'd become accustomed to crumbs of affection from someone who'd once showered me with spontaneous hugs and declarations of love. Or maybe it had been sudden, triggered by Sophia's arrival and her subtle campaign to position me as an obstacle to their happiness, rather than a foundation that had made their comfort possible. She'd never said anything directly accusatory, but she'd perfected the art of asking questions that planted seeds of doubt. "Don't you think your mother would be happier with people her own age? Wouldn't it be nice if she had her own space where she could do whatever she wanted?" What I wanted was to be needed, to be valued, to be treated like someone whose decades of sacrifice had earned her a permanent place in the family she'd created and nurtured. But wanting something didn't make it possible, and needing something didn't make it available. The afternoon brought another round of humiliating phone calls to potential landlords, who seemed to lose interest the moment they realized I was a 62-year-old woman with no recent rental history and no cosigner. "We've had a lot of interest," they'd say, their voices already moving on to more promising applicants who could satisfy their requirements for financial security and social acceptability. By evening, I found myself sitting on the hotel bed, staring at my bank balance on my phone screen and calculating how many more nights I could afford before I'd be forced to sleep in my car or seek shelter at one of the homeless facilities I'd read about in the newspaper. The idea of standing in line with other displaced people, waiting for a bed in a room full of strangers, made my chest tight with panic and shame. I'd worked my entire adult life, paid my taxes, raised a productive member of society, and contributed to my community in dozens of small ways that had never earned recognition, but had always felt meaningful. Now I was learning that none of that mattered when circumstances shifted, and the safety net I'd thought existed revealed itself to be an illusion. The television droned in the background, showing advertisements for products I could no longer afford and vacation destinations I'd never see. Happy families smiled from the screen, demonstrating the kind of multi-generational harmony that existed only in marketing fantasies designed to sell cars and insurance policies to people who still believed in the myth of family loyalty. I thought about calling Carlos, not to ask for anything, but just to hear his voice and maybe understand how someone could sleep peacefully after destroying the person who'd given them life and love, and every opportunity they'd ever had. But pride, or maybe self-preservation, kept my fingers away from his number. I'd already been rejected once this week. I didn't have the emotional reserves to survive another dismissal. Instead, I called the church where I'd attended services sporadically over the years, hoping that maybe Father Miguel would have suggestions for temporary housing or know of resources for women in crisis situations. The phone rang 6 times before an answering machine picked up, informing me that the parish office was closed and that emergencies should be directed to the diocese's main number. Emergency. Was this an emergency? I wasn't injured or in immediate physical danger, just homeless and running out of money and options. Did that qualify as the kind of crisis that deserved immediate attention? Or was I just another elderly woman whose poor planning had created predictable consequences? The diocese number connected me to another answering machine, and I hung up without leaving a message. What would I say? That I was a member of the congregation who attended Mass maybe once a month and needed help because my family had abandoned me. That I was looking for charity from an institution I'd never supported with anything more than occasional attendance and minimal donations. Night fell with the same indifferent efficiency that had marked every sunset since my world collapsed, and I realized I was becoming someone I'd never imagined being. A woman with no home, no family support, and no clear path forward. The hotel room felt like a waiting room for a life that might never begin, a temporary space between the existence I'd lost and the future I couldn't envision. I lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the parking lot, car doors slamming, engines starting, people coming and going with purpose and destination, while I remained suspended in a limbo of my own making, or maybe not my own making. Maybe this was simply what happened when you loved people more than they loved you, when you sacrificed everything for someone who eventually decided your sacrifice was insufficient. My phone sat silent on the nightstand beside Carlos's photo, and I found myself hoping it would ring with an apology, an invitation to come home, an acknowledgement that throwing away your mother was a mistake that could be corrected with enough regret and humility. But the phone remained silent, and gradually I began to understand that some mistakes aren't meant to be corrected. They're meant to teach lessons about the true nature of the people who make them. Carlos had shown me who he really was when he thought no one was watching, when being decent required effort rather than instinct. The revelation should have made me angry, but instead it made me feel empty, hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside my chest and removed everything that had once made me feel alive and necessary. I was learning that heartbreak wasn't just an expression, it was a physical reality that made breathing feel like work, and existing feel like punishment. Tomorrow I would have to make more phone calls, look at more apartments I couldn't afford, and continue the humiliating process of trying to convince strangers that a homeless elderly woman deserved basic shelter. But tonight, I finally accepted that the life I'd known was truly over, and I had no idea what, if anything, would replace it. The darkness outside my window was absolute, and it matched the darkness I felt settling over everything I'd once believed about family, love, and the rewards that were supposed to come to those who lived their lives with kindness and dedication. But I still had something they'd forgotten about, something that might change everything, though I didn't know it yet. Friday morning brought an eviction notice slipped under my hotel room door, not because I hadn't paid, but because they needed the room for a convention booking that would bring them more money than my extended stay. 48 hours to find somewhere else to go, presented in the polite language of business necessity that made my homelessness sound like a minor scheduling inconvenience. I sat on the bed holding the notice, and something inside me shifted. Not hope exactly, but something harder and more durable. A quiet recognition that I'd been approaching this crisis all wrong. I'd been begging for scraps from a world that saw me as disposable, trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I had none. But they were wrong. And more importantly, I was wrong to accept their assessment. I walked to the mirror above the dresser and looked at myself. Really looked. For the first time since this nightmare began. I saw a woman who'd worked 43 years without ever calling in sick unless she was genuinely ill. A woman who'd raised a son alone while holding down 2 jobs and somehow managed to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. A woman who'd never asked for handouts or made excuses or blamed other people for her problems. The face in the mirror belonged to someone who'd survived her husband's abandonment, the textile factory closing, economic downturns, and a dozen smaller crises that would have broken weaker people. When had I started believing that surviving all of that made me weak instead of strong? I remembered something then. A memory that had been buried under weeks of humiliation and despair. 23 years ago, when Carlos was 11 and we were living paycheck to paycheck, a man had come to our door during one of the worst storms of the winter. He was maybe 30 years old, soaked to the skin, carrying a small suitcase and looking like someone who'd run out of options. "Ma'am," he'd said when I opened the door, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I saw your light on. My car broke down about a mile back, and I've been walking in this rain for 2 hours. I don't have money for a hotel and the shelters are full. I know this is asking a lot, but could I maybe sleep on your couch just for tonight? I'll leave first thing in the morning." Carlos had been behind me, probably wondering why his mother was talking to a stranger at 9 o'clock at night during a thunderstorm. Most people would have said no. It was dangerous, impractical, the kind of thing that smart women didn't do when they were alone with their children. But something about the man's eyes reminded me of my own desperation during the months after my husband left, when I'd knocked on doors looking for work and been turned away again and again. I'd seen that particular combination of hope and humiliation that comes when you're forced to ask strangers for help you shouldn't need. "Come in," I'd said, stepping aside to let him enter. "You're soaked through. Let me get you a towel and some dry clothes." His name was Eduardo Silva, and he was traveling from São Paulo to Brasília for a job interview at a construction company. His car had been making strange noises for weeks, but he couldn't afford repairs and had gambled that it would last until he could earn enough money to fix it properly. The gamble had failed on a dark highway during the worst weather of the season. I'd given him dinner, rice and beans and the last piece of chicken I'd been saving for Carlos's lunch the next day, and listened to his story while he dried his clothes by the heater. He was an engineer who'd been laid off when his company downsized, had been unemployed for 8 months, and was down to his last 200 reais when this job opportunity appeared. "I know it's not much," he'd said the next morning, pressing a 20 real note into my hand despite my protests. "But when I get my first paycheck, I'll send you more. You saved my life last night, and I won't forget that." I'd told him to keep his money, that he'd need every real for his interview and whatever came after. But he'd insisted, saying that accepting help meant nothing if you didn't plan to pay it back when circumstances improved. "Someday," he'd said, shaking my hand with the formality of someone making a solemn promise, "when I'm in a position to help people the way you helped me, I'll remember what kindness looks like. And if you ever need anything, Anything at all. You find a way to contact Eduardo Silva, and I'll move mountains to help you. I'd written my name and address on a piece of paper and given it to him, more to make him feel better about accepting charity than because I expected ever to hear from him again. People said things like that when they were grateful, but gratitude faded and life moved on, and eventually, good intentions became memories that were easier to forget than honor. But I'd kept the business card he'd left behind, a simple white rectangle with just his name and a phone number, printed on cheap paper that suggested someone just starting to build a professional reputation. Over the years, I'd found it occasionally while cleaning out drawers, and it had always made me smile to remember the night I'd sheltered a stranger and sent him back into the world with dry clothes and a full stomach. Where was that card now? Had it been thrown away with everything else Sophia had deemed unworthy of preservation? Or might it still be somewhere among my belongings, assuming any of my belongings had survived their exposure to weather and theft? The thought of Eduardo Silva made me remember something else I'd forgotten in my desperation to solve my immediate housing crisis. I wasn't completely without resources. During my 43 years of work, I'd been careful with money, saving small amounts even when it seemed impossible. Most of those savings had gone to Carlos's education and various family emergencies over the years. But there was one account I'd never touched, never even mentioned to anyone. My mother had left me a small inheritance when she died 15 years ago. Not much, maybe 8,000 reais, and I'd put it in a separate savings account that I'd pretended didn't exist. It was meant to be emergency money, though I'd somehow convinced myself that no emergency was quite severe enough to justify touching money that represented my mother's final gift to me. But sitting in a hotel room with an eviction notice and dwindling options, I finally understood that this was exactly the kind of emergency my mother would have wanted her money to address. She'd been a practical woman who believed in taking care of family, and she would have been furious to know that I was accepting homelessness rather than using resources she'd specifically left for my security. I called the bank and confirmed the account was still active, still earning modest interest after all these years of neglect. 8,734 reais. Enough for several months of hotel stays while I figured out a more permanent solution, or enough for deposits and first month's rent on a modest apartment if I could find a landlord willing to overlook my current circumstances. The money changed everything, not because it solved all my problems, but because it reminded me that I had options beyond begging for mercy from people who'd already demonstrated their capacity for cruelty. I didn't have to accept the first barely adequate solution that presented itself. I could take my time, make thoughtful decisions, choose my next steps instead of simply reacting to whatever disaster struck next. More importantly, having resources meant I could afford to maintain my dignity while I rebuilt my life. I wouldn't have to grovel or accept charity or position myself as someone deserving of pity. I could pay my own way and make my own choices, and remember what it felt like to be a person whose needs mattered. I spent the afternoon making a different kind of phone call, not desperate pleas to landlords who saw me as a risk to be managed, but confident inquiries about apartments that might suit someone looking for a quiet, comfortable place to start over. I described myself as a retiree seeking a peaceful environment, which was true enough and sounded infinitely better than homeless woman with no references. The conversations went differently when I approached them from a position of choice rather than desperation. I wasn't asking anyone to take a chance on me. I was evaluating whether their property met my standards. The shift in tone was subtle but transformative, changing me from supplicant to customer in ways that affected how people responded to my questions. By evening, I'd scheduled appointments to view 3 apartments in neighborhoods I'd never considered before, areas where older residents were common rather than unusual, where my age might be seen as an indication of stability rather than liability. The apartments were smaller than the house I'd lost, but they were clean, affordable, and available to someone who could pay deposits and provide bank statements proving financial responsibility. I also did something I hadn't done since this crisis began. I bought myself a decent meal at a restaurant instead of surviving on convenience store sandwiches and hotel vending machine snacks. The simple act of sitting at a table with real plates and silverware, of choosing from a menu instead of calculating the cheapest available calories, reminded me that I was still a person worthy of basic comforts and small pleasures. As I walked back to the hotel through streets that no longer felt quite so hostile, I found myself thinking about Eduardo Silva and wondering what had become of the desperate young man I'd sheltered during that long-ago storm. Had he gotten the job? Had his luck changed? Had he built the kind of life that would allow him to help other people the way I'd once helped him? I would probably never know, but thinking about him reminded me of something important. Kindness wasn't weakness, and helping others didn't make you a victim. Sometimes it made you strong enough to help yourself when the time came to fight for your own survival. The hotel room felt different when I returned, less like a temporary shelter and more like a stepping stone to something better. Tomorrow, I would look at apartments and choose my future instead of accepting whatever scraps other people were willing to offer me. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep planning instead of just surviving. Saturday brought a strange sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I woke up in the hotel room, not with the familiar dread that had been my companion since this ordeal began, but with something that felt almost like anticipation. Today, I would look at apartments, but more importantly, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life on my own terms. The first apartment was in a quiet neighborhood 15 minutes from my old house. Close enough that I might occasionally run into people I knew, but far enough that I wouldn't have to drive past the life I'd lost every time I went to the grocery store. The building was older, but well-maintained, with wide hallways and an elevator that worked smoothly, designed in an era when accessibility was built in rather than retrofitted. The landlord, Señora Carmen Vasconcelos, was a woman in her 70s who owned 3 small apartment buildings and managed them herself with the efficiency of someone who'd been solving other people's housing problems for decades. She greeted me at the entrance with the kind of firm handshake that suggested she judged people by their character rather than their circumstances. "So you're looking for a quiet place," she said as we rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. "Good. I don't rent to party people or anyone who thinks their music should be shared with the entire building. My tenants value peace, and I make sure they get it." The apartment was perfect in its simplicity. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with enough space for a small table, and a living room with windows that faced east toward a courtyard where someone had planted gardens between the buildings. The previous tenant had lived there for 12 years before moving to live with her daughter, and she'd left the place immaculately clean with a few basic furnishings that the landlord was willing to include in the rent. "References?" Señora Vasconcelos asked, pulling out a rental application that looked like it had been photocopied dozens of times. "I have bank statements," I said, handing her the documents I'd printed that morning. "I can pay first and last month's rent plus security deposit today if you're willing to work with me on the reference situation. I'm in transition right now, but as you can see, I have the financial resources to be a reliable tenant." She studied the bank statements with the attention of someone who'd learned to read between the lines of people's financial situations. "In transition," she repeated. "Divorce?" "Family difficulties," I said, which was true enough and didn't require me to explain the humiliating details of my son's betrayal. Sometimes you have to make changes when circumstances shift. Something in my tone must have conveyed enough information, because she nodded with the understanding of someone who'd probably seen every variation of family disaster that led people to need new housing quickly. "I've been renting apartments for 38 years, she said, folding the bank statements and handing them back to me. "You learn to recognize people who will take care of a place and people who won't. You strike me as someone who takes care of things." We completed the paperwork sitting at her kitchen table in the apartment directly below the one I was renting, and I found myself wondering if this was what normal felt like, making rational decisions about practical matters with people who treated you like an adult capable of managing your own affairs. "You can move in tomorrow if you want," she said, accepting my check for the deposits and first month's rent. "I'll have the utilities transferred into your name by Monday." "Welcome to the building, Señora Santos." The second apartment I'd planned to view suddenly seemed unnecessary. This place felt right in ways that had nothing to do with square footage or amenities, and everything to do with being treated with basic respect by someone who understood that housing was about more than just profit margins. I spent the rest of Saturday buying basics: sheets, towels, a few plates and cups, enough groceries to stock the refrigerator and pantry with simple meals for the next week. Each purchase felt like a small act of defiance against the narrative that I was too old, too poor, too problematic to deserve ordinary comforts. The salespeople treated me like any other customer, asking if I needed help finding anything, suggesting products that might meet my needs, processing my payments with the same professional courtesy they showed everyone else. No one looked at me and saw a charity case or a burden, or someone whose circumstances should inspire pity rather than respect. Sunday morning, I loaded my car with my hotel belongings and the new items I'd purchased, and drove to my apartment building with something that felt remarkably like excitement. The cleaning lady from the hotel had helped me carry my bags down to the car, refusing to accept the tip I offered but accepting my promise that I would remember her kindness. Que Dios la bendiga, she said, hugging me with genuine warmth. You are strong. I see it in your eyes. Strong women like us. We survive everything. Moving into the apartment took 3 hours, including the time I spent arranging furniture and putting away groceries, and hanging the few pictures I'd managed to save from my old life. The photo of Carlos went into a drawer rather than onto a shelf, not because I wanted to forget him, but because I needed to remember myself as someone who existed independently of his approval or rejection. By afternoon, I was sitting at my new kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out at the courtyard where an elderly man was tending vegetables in a raised garden bed. The scene was peaceful in ways I'd forgotten were possible, suggesting the kind of community where people minded their own business but were available if you needed help. I had enough money left from my mother's inheritance to live modestly for several months while I figured out longer-term plans. Maybe I would look for part-time work, something that would provide income and purpose without the physical demands of the factory jobs that had sustained me for most of my working life. Maybe I would volunteer with organizations that helped other women in crisis situations, using my experience to guide people through the kind of disaster I'd just survived. But first, I wanted to find something I'd been thinking about since my memory of Eduardo Silva had surfaced. Before Sophia had disposed of my belongings, I'd managed to retrieve a few items from the garbage bags she'd left on the porch, including a small wooden box where I kept important papers and sentimental items that had seemed too precious to trust to regular storage. I opened the box carefully, sorting through birth certificates, old insurance policies, and letters from relatives who'd passed away years ago. And there, pressed between pages of Carlos's elementary school report cards, was the business card Eduardo Silva had left behind 23 years ago. The paper was yellowed, and the edges were soft from age, but the printing was still legible. Eduardo Silva, Ingeniero Civil, with a phone number that was probably disconnected and an address that might no longer exist. But it was something, a connection to a moment when I'd chosen kindness over caution and helped someone who'd needed exactly what I was able to provide. I held the card up to the window light, studying it like an artifact from a previous life, when I'd been someone who opened doors to strangers and shared meals with people who had nowhere else to turn. That woman seemed both foreign and familiar now. Foreign because I'd forgotten her generosity and strength, familiar because she was still here, buried under months of humiliation, but not destroyed by it. The smart thing would probably be to throw the card away, to accept that 23 years was too long to expect anyone to remember a debt of gratitude, especially someone who'd probably built a successful life and moved far beyond the circumstances that had brought him to my door during that winter storm. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity about what had happened to the desperate young man I'd helped. Maybe it was the memory of his promise to move mountains if I ever needed assistance. Maybe it was simply the recognition that I had nothing to lose by trying to reconnect with someone who'd once seen me as his salvation rather than his burden. I found myself thinking about the strange timing of everything. How I'd remembered Eduardo Silva just when I needed to remember my own capacity for kindness. How his business card had survived when so many other mementos had been lost or destroyed. How his promise had been made during a storm, not unlike the one that had just torn through my own life. The rational part of my mind insisted that people moved, changed phone numbers, forgot promises made in moments of desperation. But the part of me that had chosen to help a stranger 23 years ago was willing to believe that some connections transcended time and circumstance, that kindness created bonds that could survive decades of separation. I placed the business card on my kitchen table next to my coffee cup and studied it while the afternoon sun moved across the courtyard and the elderly man finished his garden work. Tomorrow I would research Eduardo Silva, see if I could find any current contact information, discover what had become of the young engineer who'd promised to remember my kindness. It probably wouldn't lead to anything. He'd probably forgotten me completely, if he was even still alive and reachable. But for the first time in months, I had the luxury of pursuing something because I wanted to, rather than because I was desperate. The apartment felt peaceful around me, filled with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. Outside my window, the world continued its familiar rhythms. But I was no longer just surviving its indifference. I was preparing to reclaim my place in it. Monday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with Eduardo Silva's business card and my phone, trying to decide if reaching out to someone after 23 years was an act of hope or desperation. The number on the card was probably disconnected, the address likely obsolete, but something compelled me to try. I started with an internet search at the public library, typing Eduardo Silva Ingeniero Civil into the computer, and hoping the universe might offer some small mercy after weeks of relentless disappointment. What I found made me stop breathing for a moment. Eduardo Silva wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was the founder and CEO of Silva Construction Group, one of the largest development companies in the state. The website showed a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit, standing in front of buildings that reached toward the sky like monuments to success I couldn't have imagined when he'd stood dripping in my living room. The desperate young man who'd knocked on my door during that winter storm had become someone whose projects reshaped entire neighborhoods, whose company employed hundreds of people, whose success was measured in millions of rees and square kilometers of developed land. The transformation was so complete it seemed impossible that this polished executive had ever needed shelter from anyone, especially from a textile worker living paycheck to paycheck. I stared at his corporate photo for a long time, looking for traces of the exhausted traveler I'd fed rice and beans while his clothes dried by my heater. His face had filled out, his hair had grayed at the temples, and his eyes held the confidence of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with enough money and determination. But something about his expression reminded me of that night, a warmth that suggested success hadn't completely erased his memory of what it felt like to need help. The company's main office was listed as being in São Paulo, with regional offices in 6 other cities including one here in town. The local address was in the business district, in one of those glass towers that had been built during the economic boom of the past decade. Eduardo Silva had literally risen above the circumstances that had brought him to my door. But he'd also come back to the area where we'd first met. I spent an hour reading about his company's projects, shopping centers, residential developments, office buildings that housed the kinds of businesses where Carlos worked and felt important. Silva Construction Group specialized in what the website called human-centered development, projects that balanced profit with community needs and environmental responsibility. One article mentioned Eduardo's personal philosophy: success means nothing if it doesn't include the obligation to help others climb the same ladder you've used to reach your goals. Another quoted him saying that his company's mission was to create opportunities for people who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional business practices. The language sounded like corporate marketing, but something about the consistency of the message across multiple interviews suggested it might be genuine. This was a man who'd built an empire while apparently maintaining some memory of what it felt like to be powerless and dependent on the kindness of strangers. But 23 years was a long time. People changed, circumstances evolved, and the grateful young man who'd promised to move mountains for the woman who'd helped him might have become someone who saw such promises as naive sentiments from a different life. Successful people learn to protect themselves from requests for help that could quickly become overwhelming obligations. I printed out the company's contact information and walked home through streets that suddenly felt charged with possibility. Maybe reaching out would lead to nothing more than polite acknowledgement from an assistant who'd been trained to handle requests from people claiming historical connections to the CEO. Maybe Eduardo Silva had forgotten me completely, or remembered me only as one of dozens of people who'd helped him during his journey from poverty to prosperity. But maybe, just maybe, he was someone who honored his debts, who understood that some obligations transcended business relationships and social status, who remembered what it felt like to stand at someone's door with nothing to offer except gratitude and hope. That evening, I drafted a letter on my computer, choosing words carefully to strike the right balance between familiarity and respect. I reminded him of the night he'd spent at my house, mentioned specific details that only someone who'd been there could know, and explained my current circumstances without making my contact sound like a desperate plea for rescue. 23 years ago, you promised that if I ever needed help, I should find a way to contact you, I wrote. I'm not writing to ask for money or charity. I'm writing because I'm starting over at 62, and sometimes when you're rebuilding your life, it helps to reconnect with people who understood your kindness when the world seemed determined to overlook it. I sealed the letter in an envelope and addressed it to Eduardo Silva personally, marking it personal and confidential, in the hope that it might reach him rather than being filtered through whatever system protected successful people from unwanted correspondence. Tuesday morning, I mailed the letter from the post office, paying extra for delivery confirmation so I'd know it had reached its destination. Then I tried to forget about it, focusing instead on the practical tasks of settling into my new apartment and beginning to plan whatever came next in my life. But Wednesday afternoon, as I was arranging books on the small shelf I'd bought for the living room, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another marketing call from companies trying to sell insurance or home security systems to people whose names had appeared on some list of recent address changes. Señora Santos? The voice was professional but warm, with an accent that suggested education and refinement. This is Isabel Moreira from Silva Construction Group. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Eduardo Silva, who received your letter yesterday. My heart stopped. He'd gotten the letter, remembered enough to have someone call me back, cared enough to respond within 24 hours. But having an assistant call suggested the kind of polite distance that successful people maintained between themselves and the complications of their past. Mr. Silva would very much like to speak with you personally, Isabel continued, but he's currently in meetings that will run until late this evening. He's asked me to coordinate a time when you might be available to meet with him tomorrow. Meet with him, not a phone call, not a brief conversation, but an actual meeting that suggested he was taking my contact seriously enough to invest time and attention in renewing our connection. Would 10 o'clock tomorrow morning be convenient? Isabel asked. Mr. Silva suggested meeting at your home, if that would be comfortable for you, or at his office if you'd prefer a more formal setting. My home. He wanted to come to my apartment, to step back into the kind of modest domestic space where we'd first met, rather than requiring me to navigate the intimidating landscape of corporate offices and executive assistants. My home would be fine, I managed to say, giving her my new address and wondering what Eduardo Silva would think of the woman who'd once been confident enough to shelter strangers, but who was now rebuilding her life in a 2-bedroom apartment with borrowed furniture. Excellent, Isabel said. Mr. Silva is very much looking forward to seeing you again. He's mentioned your kindness many times over the years, and he's grateful for the opportunity to reconnect. After we hung up, I sat in my living room trying to process what had just happened. In less than 48 hours, a letter sent with minimal expectations had generated a response that suggested Eduardo Silva not only remembered me, but considered our reunion important enough to rearrange his schedule and travel to my home. The practical part of my mind insisted on managing my expectations. He was probably just being polite, fulfilling an obligation to someone who'd helped him when he was vulnerable. The meeting would likely be brief and cordial, a chance for him to express gratitude in person before returning to his successful life and forgetting about me again. But something deeper suggested this might be different. The speed of his response, his willingness to meet at my home, Isabel's tone when she'd mentioned how often he'd spoken of my kindness, all of it indicated that my letter had triggered something more significant than polite obligation. Thursday morning, I prepared my apartment like I was expecting royalty, not because Eduardo Silva's success intimidated me, but because I wanted him to see that the woman who'd helped him had maintained her dignity, despite the circumstances that had forced her to start over. I made coffee and arranged the simple cookies I'd bought at the grocery store on a plate that had belonged to my mother. I put on my best dress, not fancy, but clean and pressed and representative of someone who took care of herself and her surroundings. At exactly 10 o'clock, a black car pulled up outside my building. Not a limousine, but clearly expensive. The kind of vehicle that announced its owner's success without being ostentatious about it. The man who emerged was unmistakably Eduardo Silva, though 23 years of prosperity had transformed him in ways that photographs couldn't capture. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. But when he looked up at my building, his expression carried something that reminded me of the uncertain young man who'd stood at my door during that winter storm. I watched from my window as he entered the building, and found myself holding my breath as I waited for his knock on my door, wondering if the next few minutes would validate my decision to reach out or confirm that some connections were too fragile to survive the passage of time and the weight of changed circumstances. When the knock came, it was gentle but confident, the sound of someone who'd learned to command attention without demanding it. I opened the door to find Eduardo Silva standing in my hallway, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across 23 years of separation and transformation. He was taller than I remembered, his shoulders broader, his presence commanding in ways that success had taught him to project. But his eyes held the same combination of intelligence and vulnerability that had made me trust him enough to open my door during that winter storm. "Donna Marcia," he said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "you look exactly as I've remembered you all these years." It was a kind lie. I was 23 years older, marked by decades of work and worry and recent heartbreak, but something in his tone suggested he saw past the physical changes to the essence of the woman who'd given him shelter when he had nowhere else to turn. "Eduardo," I said, stepping aside to welcome him into my modest apartment. "Please, come in." I made coffee. He entered with the careful attention of someone who understood that homes revealed character in ways that offices never could. His eyes moved across my simple furniture, my few decorative items, the photo albums I'd arranged on the shelf, taking inventory not with judgment but with recognition. "You still have that," he said, noticing the small wooden cross that hung near my kitchen window. The same cross that had been in my old house, inherited from my grandmother and moved to every home I'd ever made. The fact that he remembered such a small detail after more than 2 decades told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he'd become despite his wealth and status. Success hadn't erased his capacity for attention to the things that mattered to the people who'd mattered to him. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee and cookies, and for a few minutes we talked about safe topics: the weather, changes in the city, how different everything looked after so many years. But gradually, the conversation moved toward deeper territory as Eduardo asked about my life, and I found myself telling him about Carlos, about the marriage that had sustained me and the abandonment that had nearly destroyed me. "Your son asked you to leave?" Eduardo's voice carried controlled anger, the kind of fury that successful people learn to channel into action rather than allowing it to show as weakness. "After everything you sacrificed to raise him?" I explained the gradual deterioration of our relationship, Sophia's influence, the way I'd been made to feel like an inconvenience rather than the foundation that had made their comfort possible. Eduardo listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. "And where are you working now?" he asked. "I'm not," I admitted. "I'm living on savings while I figure out what comes next. At 62, employers aren't exactly fighting for the chance to hire me." Eduardo was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if calculating something complex. When he looked up, his expression had transformed into something I could only describe as determined. "Donna Marcia," he said, "do you remember what I told you that morning when I left your house? You said when you were in a position to help people, you'd remember what kindness looked like. And I promised that if you ever needed anything, you should contact me and I'd move mountains to help you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I've been waiting 23 years to honor that promise. The envelope contained documents that took me several minutes to understand. Legal papers establishing a trust fund in my name, managed by Eduardo's company, with a monthly distribution that was more than double what I'd earned during my best years at the textile factory, health insurance that would cover anything I might need for the rest of my life, and most incredibly, the deed to a house, Not a mansion, but a comfortable 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. "This is too much," I said, my hands shaking as I tried to process what he was offering. "I gave you one night of shelter. This is a life. You gave me hope when I had none," Eduardo replied. "You fed me when you had little food for yourself. You trusted a stranger when most people would have seen only danger. That night changed the trajectory of my entire existence, because it proved that decent people still existed in a world that had been showing me only cruelty." He went on to explain how that job interview had launched his career, how the confidence he'd gained from surviving his lowest point had driven him to build something significant, how my kindness had become the foundation principle of everything he'd achieved. "I've spent 23 years looking for ways to honor the debt I owe you," he said. "I've helped hundreds of people because you taught me that helping was possible. But I've never forgotten that you were the first person to see me as worth saving." I started to cry then, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that the universe sometimes did remember kindness, that seeds planted in winter storms could grow into forests that provided shelter for others decades later. "There's something else," Eduardo said gently. "If you want it, I'd like to offer you a position with my company. Not charity work, but real employment managing our community outreach programs. You'd be helping other people navigate crises like the one you've just survived." The irony was perfect. After being discarded by my own family as worthless, I was being offered meaningful work by someone who understood that my experience with hardship had given me qualifications that couldn't be taught in business schools. 2 hours later, Eduardo left my apartment, but not before calling his assistant to begin the paperwork that would transform my life. Within a week, I'd be moving into my new house. Within a month, I'd be starting work that would allow me to guide other displaced women through the kind of crisis I'd just survived. That evening, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by legal documents that represented security I'd never dared imagine, my phone rang. It was Carlos. "Mom?" His voice carried uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure I'd answer. "Sophia told me someone saw you talking to some rich guy today. Is everything okay?" I almost laughed at the assumption that a woman like me couldn't possibly have legitimate connections to successful people, that any interaction with wealth must indicate some kind of emergency or confusion that required family intervention. "Everything is fine, Carlos," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Better than fine, actually." "Well, look, I've been thinking," he continued, and I could hear Sophia prompting him in the background. "Maybe we were a little hasty the other day. You could probably come back home if you want. We could work something out." The offer came too late and from the wrong motivation, not because he'd realized his cruelty was unforgivable, but because he was worried that his mother's apparent connection to money might represent opportunities he was missing. He wasn't apologizing for his betrayal. He was hedging his bets in case my circumstances had improved in ways that might benefit him. "That's very generous," I said, "but I have a home now. A good one. I'm exactly where I need to be." The silence on his end told me he was processing implications he hadn't expected. "Mom, if you need help with anything—" "I don't," I replied with gentle finality, "but thank you for calling." After I hung up, I walked to my window and looked out at the courtyard where the elderly man was watering his garden in the evening light. Tomorrow, I would begin packing for my move to the house Eduardo had given me. Next month, I would start work that would allow me to help other women discover their own strength in the face of family betrayal and societal indifference. I thought about the woman who'd sat in the rain outside her son's house just 2 weeks ago, believing her life was over, accepting that she was too old and too worthless to deserve better treatment. That woman had been wrong about almost everything, but she'd been right about one thing. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. Eduardo Silva had kept his promise to move mountains for the woman who'd shown him kindness. But more importantly, I'd learned that the woman who'd been brave enough to help a stranger 23 years ago was still here, still strong, still capable of building something beautiful from the wreckage of other people's cruelty. Carlos had been right about one thing. I'd found something better, not just a house or financial security or meaningful work, but the recognition that I'd always been worthy of love and respect, even when the people closest to me were too blind to see it. The rain had finally stopped. and everything it had washed away had been replaced by something immeasurably better. I'd learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover how much you're actually worth, and I was worth more than I'd ever dared to dream.